Welcome back to those of you who are returning, and welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first time. The program is being recorded, and so if you decide you would like a friend to watch it, I will be sending out a link to the recording. It seems like it takes them a little time to set that up. I'm still waiting for the last two, but I will get them out to people as soon as I get them. If you're not on the mailing list, and/or you want a copy of today's handout and you didn't get it for some reason, you should contact my supervisor. Her name is Sandra Satterfield, and her email address is SSATTERFIELD. So it's Satterfield at Delaware Hospice, HOSPICE.org, and she can send you the handout. You can also contact me, Judith Pearson, just small letters, my first name, JUDITHPIERSON, at Juno, JUNO.com, which is apparently, from the store clerk I meet, is an old email thing. But hey, I'm 67. I'm just glad I know how to use a computer. All right, so today we're going to talk about your most embarrassing habit. Everybody has some habit that they wish they didn't have. They wish they could just get rid of. They've tried to get rid of it, and they can't get rid of it. So I'm going to give you a whole new way of looking at that old habit, and maybe a far better way to figure out how to break free of its hold. So I'm sorry I have to tell you this, but it's really important that you understand that the past is not behind you. People tell me that all the time, and I say, I wish that were really true. I'd be out of a job, but I'd figure out something else to do, maybe do stand-up comedy. But anyhow, your past is not behind you. It lives on in the beliefs you have about yourself, the beliefs you have about other people, and the beliefs you have about the world and how safe it is. It also lives on in the coping strategies that you developed growing up that have sort of outlived their usefulness in today's world and your adult world, but they're really hard to let go of. And they're hard to let go of because they have very deep roots, and they're anchored in place by strong feelings of fear or sadness or anger. So you can't just say to yourself, I should just stop doing that. It's not rational. I'm just going to stop doing it, and it goes away. I'm sure everybody's already tried that. It doesn't work. These habits are really anchored in experiences that you had when you were very, very young. And guess what? Now science knows that many of those experiences that happen in childhood are recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, we have both right and left hemispheres to the brain, and there's a little bridge between them that's called the corpus callosum. And so right hemisphere of the brain, you may have heard of the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which has to do with tapping into your creativity. So the right side of your brain is a more creative part of your brain. Left hemisphere is more associated with sort of executive functioning. It's the more rational part. It knows how to make things happen. It's much more logical. But it turns out that many of the experiences that we have in early childhood actually get registered and recorded and are anchored in the right hemisphere of the brain. Trauma in childhood, in particular, is primarily recorded in the right side of the brain. Now, the reason that's so significant is that while we're born with right and left hemispheres, the right hemisphere dominates for most of our childhood. Left hemisphere dominance, and I'm quoting, is only achieved very gradually over the course of the first 18 years of life. In addition, the corpus callosum, as I explained, the part of the brain that joins the two hemispheres, that makes possible right brain, left brain communication, also develops slowly and only becomes fully elaborated around the age of 12. That's what Fisher writes. So the part of your brain that can connect right and left hemisphere really only gets strong around the age of 12. So that's important to know. Prior to 12, we don't have a good connection between the right and left hemisphere, and we're primarily dominated by our right hemisphere. The reason this is also particularly significant is because the right hemisphere of the brain doesn't have words. It doesn't have words. So it's likely to find it hard to accurately recall and articulate things that happen in childhood because they were recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain, which doesn't have words. Alan Shore explains that the right hemisphere of the brain doesn't have words, it is more visual, but it does read body language and facial expressions. So even at a young age, even in toddlers, even in infants, that the right part of the hemisphere of the brain does record the reaction they see on people's faces. So they often do know if a parent's angry or annoyed with them. But again, it's registered in the right hemisphere of the brain, which might not be easy to record or remember afterwards. He writes, traumatic memories are recorded in the right hemisphere outside of conscious awareness. Keep that in mind. Outside of conscious awareness. It's recorded in the part of the brain that is not very conscious. And this realm represents the traumatic memories in imagistic forms. What he's saying is you're recording those experiences as images, not necessarily something associated with words. So they're recorded as images. They're also recorded along with the survival behaviors employed as a result of the abuse. So whatever survival behaviors you developed as a child, it's recorded in the right hemisphere of your brain, but the connection to that is not available necessarily or even conscious to the left hemisphere of the brain. So this allows for the fact, and this is the rest of the quote, this allows for the fact that emotional learning of the right, especially of stressful, threatening events, what we learned during those events, can be unknown to the left hemisphere of the brain. So we may find it hard to put those experiences into word, and they may remain outside of our conscious awareness. So it is entirely possible that childhood experiences, especially those that were disturbing, are stored as visual images and the survival behaviors that were adapted to cope with that trauma. They may not be available to the left hemisphere of the brain, which is where you develop verbal and narrative memory. Verbal and narrative memory means, memory that you can put words to, and narrative is the capacity to tell the story of what happened. But you may not be, that's available in the left hemisphere of the brain, but experiences that are recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain may not be translated into verbal and narrative memory. So it's very important because what this means is that we engage in behaviors that were developed very early in life, up to the age of 12, easily, according to them, and they're not tied necessarily to conscious memories. They're tied to visual images. They're tied to our coping strategies. What we did, for example, to try to calm down that person that we thought was going to hurt us. What we developed as ways to avoid getting hurt or yelled at or judged. It doesn't have to be, not necessarily talking about severe physical or even sexual abuse here, although that's obviously included, but even the more subtle stuff. Because when you're very short, when you're just a little being, even people's judgments are profoundly hurtful. We experience things much more intensely as children. So verbal abuse, emotional abuse, things that may seem subtle actually have a profound impact on children. And again, recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain, not necessarily available to the left hemisphere of the brain. And the ways we develop to cope we may do them automatically and not even be conscious of how they are tied to an experience when we were younger. So again, what this means, you may engage in behaviors today that were developed very early in life and that are not tied to conscious memories. So I like to say that the most embarrassing symptom that you have is the part of you that refuses to lie about the fact that you were hurt and you still hurt inside today. Again, it doesn't have to be that somebody beat you. It could be that somebody judged you, somebody compared you negatively to another sibling. The smallest slights get experienced quite profoundly as children, especially because we are so desperate to win the love of these people that may be saying these things we're attempting to get them to love us. So your most embarrassing symptom is the part that refuses to lie about the fact that you're still carrying around a hurt inside. It's kind of a coded message from your insides. It's sort of an unconscious attempt to both mask and reveal an underlying problem because it is still linked to things that happen. So it is also an attempt to reveal what happened or an underlying problem. But it's masked partly because we may not remember it accurately, or may not remember it in a way that we can put to words. But it may also be masked because it's something that we've done unconsciously. So a lot of the behaviors people engage in, that they'll say to me, but it's so irrational. It doesn't make sense. I don't know why I do these things. I'm going to give you some examples, and I think now you'll really understand what I'm talking about. But it may seem irrational, but I have learned from doing therapy with people and my own therapy that if you peel back the layers, you will likely discover that actually the behavior has a very profound and even logical meaning if it came out of experiences that you were attempting to cope with as a child. So, for example, you have a strong need to feel in control, and you become anxious when you aren't in control. I can't relate to this. I'm kidding. This is exactly me. You feel a strong need to be in control, and you get anxious when things feel unpredictable and not in control. If you do that, it's quite likely that you grew up in a pretty unpredictable household, right? Makes sense. Life was unpredictable as a child. What you're going to do as much as you can is try to make it as predictable today as possible. So as a kid, if something's unpredictable, you have an alcoholic father, a rageaholic mother, you may be complimented one minute and then they cut you down the next. You know those things can happen to you, and it's a chaotic kind of life. You develop this kind of hypervigilance. Sure, many of you have it. You're always scanning the horizon for danger and trying to anticipate problems before they even happen. You want to be 10 steps of a problem before it gets around the curb. So that's how you coped as a kid. You learned how to read daddy's mood. Is he getting angry? Should I get out of the room? How much did mom have to drink today? You're scanning the horizon for danger, and you're trying to anticipate those problems and nip them at the bud. And you hate it if you're caught unaware by something that sneaks up on you. It's very typical of people who really had to be very aware as children in order to stay safe. And safe doesn't mean, like I say, safe can be emotionally safe, not just physically safe. You know, you're the kind of person, you walk into a room, you immediately start sizing up the people. You know who seems angry, you know who needs to be appeased, you know whose ego needs to be stroked. And you know who's maybe already made up their mind about whatever you're bringing in to talk to them about. I did an interview years ago with Marie Claire magazine, and they wanted to know why I thought daughters of mothers who were very impaired, so famous writers, lawyers, actresses who grew up with an alcoholic mother or an rageaholic mother who grew up with abuse, why was it that they could still go on to be very successful? And I said, that is not hard to figure out at all. If you grew up having to be able to read people very quickly and size up a situation very quickly, it helps you be very successful in life. You have sort of a heightened emotional intelligence, so you can anticipate problems and you know how to read people's emotions and respond to them. So that's the good side of growing up, having to be very hypervigilant. But of course, it comes with a price. It can be very exhausting. It can lead to burnout. And you know much more about how to please others than you know how to please or to take care of yourself, because your focus is always out there on what everybody else needs. And it's very rare for you to look down into your heart and see what you need. So if you grew up having to anticipate problems as a child, then you probably have that skill now, but it also comes with a price. Also, for those of us who coped with unpredictability by being in control and on guard, not feeling in control it makes us feel incredibly vulnerable, and it creates an intolerable vulnerability. We just feel so exposed and at risk. And in real life, you have to deal with unpredictable or uncontrollable situations. For example, a loved one gets sick, or you're being tested for something and you're waiting for a diagnosis. You have to be able to tolerate that not knowing. Living with this pandemic requires tolerating a lot of not knowing. Is it safe to send my kids back to school? Is it safe for me to go to the grocery store? How long is this going to last? We're living in a time of incredible unpredictability. And for those of us who like to be in control, this can feel incredibly vulnerable, an intolerable vulnerability. So it's why you really do want to address this, because you do need to be able to tolerate feeling vulnerable and not knowing what's going to happen next. So most of our enduring personal struggles or bad habits are really rooted in childhood, and they probably started as a way to cope with too little love, too much criticism. They're rooted in attempts to win love, avoid painful feelings, bury unmet needs, or dodge physical or verbal attacks. So ask yourself if there were things you had to do, feelings you had to hide, or behaviors you had to use to please or win the love of your mother or your father, if there was anybody else very significant in your life. So just as we're going through this, I want you to be thinking about that. Who did you have to be to keep your parent or parents happy? It's probably different with each parent, but think about it. What did you have to do to make them love you and care about you? And I'm going to have you explore this a little bit later, but I just want you to pause and think about it for a moment. As I said, people often can't understand why they can't just stop a behavior they dislike because it seems irrational. So it's important to understand these behaviors serve a deeper, usually unconscious purpose. For example, having to be alert and in control can make you feel exhausted and out of control. But if you grow up not feeling completely safe, this was the way to create at least the illusion of having some control over your safety. If you were excessively criticized as a child, and criticism is very hard for children, there are ways to point children in point to areas that they need to improve. You can do this with a lot of love. None of us is perfect. We all need to learn, and we need to be able to teach our children. But many of us grew up with excessive criticism that was not balanced by a lot of accolades or appreciation for what we did right. So if you were excessively criticized as a child, um, um, even if it was just once or twice, but it was done in a very shaming way, you may develop the habit of beating others to the punch by always criticizing yourself. Rather than risk anybody else seeing your imperfections and pointing them out, you go out of your way to make sure you don't make any mistakes. You beat up yourself in order to make sure that you get it before somebody else sees it and points it out to you, because it's very shaming to have somebody point that out to you. So that's a way you might cope with being criticized a lot. You know, the messages we hear about ourselves as we were growing up, especially those that are given over and over, they really tend to stick with us because we're little kids and we swallow it whole. You know, we don't have the perspective that we have as adults. So when your father, say, for example, told you were stupid, you didn't think, well, he's just insecure about his own intelligence. No, you were a little kid and you thought, oh, it must be true, I'm stupid. And then guess what? Every time you did something that seemed to be stupid, you said to yourself, see, my dad was right. And what happens actually is that the neurons that fire together wire together. So every experience of doing something where you felt you did something stupid, and I think even that level of self-consciousness makes us do stuff, makes us do things that are stupid, just because we're so self-conscious, we're not at ease and we don't do things as well. So every time you did something that you felt proved your father was right, that you were stupid, it wired together with every other memory. And there's this belief that those neurons that fire together wire together, creating kind of a neural pathway through the brain that links all those memories together. So every time you feel like you're doing something stupid or you're afraid you're going to do something stupid, your brain shoots down that neural pathway like a really well-greased sliding board. So the minute you feel that you're at risk of doing something stupid, in some ways, all those neurons fire together, and you think of all, not consciously or out loud, you think of all those other experiences that confirm that belief, and it just goes down that neural pathway, and you're immediately afraid and worried that you're going to do something stupid. You know, I was talking about this one time on a radio station. And soon after I went off the air, this man came flying into the store where they were recording, and he told me he'd been racing to that location because he heard me give that example, and he said, that happened to me. My father told me I was stupid my whole life, and you know, I'm retired now. I was a Philadelphia police officer. I moved up the rank. I really did really well. But you know what? I still think I'm stupid. So it's hard to change beliefs that get really wired into our brains. It can be done consciously, however, by changing that internal dialogue. This is a whole other talk, but we will talk a little bit about it. But you need to start noticing what those messages are that you give yourself. And maybe as you begin to understand what the link is to the past, it'll be a little easier to step back from it and say, is that really true? Or could I talk to myself differently and say, you know, you're not really that bad. You're probably as smart as most people. Yes, you make mistakes, but guess what? So does everybody else. So a lot of it's about changing that internal dialogue, you know, which we could say a lot more about, but let's keep going. You're probably also going to have to confront the emotions that are underneath and drive these behaviors. You know, if you develop certain habits in order to survive, um, uh, not, as I said, overt abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but also the more subtle pains of like being judged. It is very scary on a conscious and unconscious level to give up those coping strategies. So if you think you protect yourself from being criticized today by always being perfect or being as perfect as possible or putting yourself down before somebody else can, trying to give up those behaviors is difficult because it probably will elicit these feelings of fear. Because this was a strategy you developed in the face of fear. You know, you were scared of being called stupid. You were afraid of being exposed as imperfect. And so the thought of giving up those coping strategies on a conscious or unconscious level does trigger those feelings that you're trying to avoid when you developed them. Now, the good news is you're not a child anymore, and nobody can hurt you in quite the same way that they hurt you when you were younger. But they're emotionally rooted, and they're hard to let go of because there are emotions attached to them. Our symptoms, our habits serve, or at least used to serve, a purpose. Judith Herman wrote about how children adapt to child abuse. And I think what she says is relevant even if your mistreatment was not as severe or ill-intended as what she's describing. And this is what she says about children. When it is impossible to avoid the reality of the abuse, The child must construct some system of meaning that justifies it. Okay, so something happens to us. We have to come up with a reason for why it happened. Inevitably, the child concludes that her innate badness is the cause. So this happened to me because I'm bad. The child seizes upon this explanation early and clings to it tenaciously, for it enables her to preserve a sense of meaning, hope, and power. If she is bad, then her parents are good. If she is bad, then she can try to be good. If somehow she has brought this fate upon herself, then somehow she has the power to change it. If she has driven her parents to mistreat her, then if only she tries hard enough, she may someday earn their forgiveness and finally win the protection and care she so desperately needs. So what Herman is saying is children have a choice. The parent is bad or I'm bad. If the parent's bad, you're in trouble because you have no control over them. But if you tell yourself it's because I did something wrong, then you hold on to the illusion of hope. Maybe if I can just change it, maybe if I can just figure out what will make them happy, then maybe I'll finally win their love. So you children seize onto this notion that it was something about them that caused the abuse because it's their only way to feel any kind of control in a situation where they really don't have a lot of control, any kind of hope in a situation that probably doesn't have a lot of hope because their parent likely isn't going to change, an illusion of having some kind of control over it, which is, a way to feel that this is tolerable. But again, what the price that comes with that is you conclude that it was something you did. Okay, I got some barking dogs. You can, as a child, conclude it must have been me. So if it's me, maybe I can fix it. And of course, really, because it was probably more the adult, and they aren't going to change, and you probably don't have any control over whether they change. You come out of childhood thinking there's something wrong with me. I was never good enough, and you can often carry that belief into your adulthood. In fact, many of us do. But at least in childhood, it gives us some hope that maybe if we just figure out what can make them happy, make them love us, we can win that love. And so it gives us an illusion that we really need at that time. So we blame ourselves to hold on to the possibility that we can control the people we can't control and change a situation that is unlikely to change and maintain the hope that it will get better. But it comes with this high price tag, as I said, with when our parents don't change, we believe on some level it was our failure. So understanding the purpose a habit or a symptom serves can help you unhook from it. Knowing that when it originated, it felt like the only way to be safe or win love or get attention helps us understand why it is so hard to just stop. And examining the root and the purpose of that problematic behavior really is the way to help you. It can help you feel less crazy because the behavior seems irrational, but maybe if you can find its original context or just kind of surmise based on what you do, it could make you feel less crazy. It really does make sense in the context in which it was developed. It helps us understand why challenging it and to stop is difficult. I've had some people that go into therapy and they maybe do rational cognitive therapy, and their therapist says, well, that's irrational, and you just have to know it's irrational and stop. And when they can't stop, they feel like failures. Well, I think it's not going to stop till you deal with the past and you deal with the feelings. It can help you be less self-critical and ultimately can help you address the core or the underlying wound from which it springs, which is really the challenge. A Sufi poet named Rumi, and many of you may know Rumi, wrote, and this is just so right, that which haunts us will always find a way out. The wound will not heal unless given witness. The shadow that follows us is the way in. So the shadow is that thing you feel ashamed of or that habit you can't break. It is your way into discovering what wound needs witnessing and healing, because those pains are going to find a way out. So rather than keep fighting it, they say what you resist, will persist. Stop and look at it with eyes of compassion. Let me talk a little bit about some of the common behaviors and things that I believe can drive it. And again, some of this you may relate to and some of it may not feel like it's relevant to you, but take what feels meaningful. And if it sparks other thoughts, pay attention to those, because everybody has their own unique combination of ways to do things. There's commonalities, but each individual has their own personality. Each situation is different. So there may be different variations on these themes. Drinking, eating, shopping too much. often reflect a deep unmet need for something that soothes you, because that's what that stuff does. It soothes you. It makes you feel better. It feels like it's filling something up. So this hunger at its roots is likely a hunger for love and nurturing. At the end of the day, that is what most of us didn't get enough of growing up, and it's what we still hunger for now. So overeating, overspending, drinking, drugging, all of that probably comes from an attempt to soothe and calm the self, something you didn't get enough of and weren't then able to internalize growing up. You know, nothing says loving like something from the oven. Somebody was brilliant when they came up with that expression, because we really do think of food as a way to nurture and soothe ourselves, and it's not illegal, and you can go to the store and get it, and um, so it's not surprising that many of us are overweight and that that's rampant in our culture. And I think all the no, 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 stop and shaming only fuels the cycle, because it's not getting to the core. And the core is you need more love and nurturing in your life. Drinking and substance abuse may be rooted in a desire to shut off that inner critic and get some inner peace and acceptance. Most of us have this inner critic that never stops talking, that points out every mistake that we ever made and is anticipating every mistake they're going to jump on us for. So that inner critic is always going, going, going and picking at us. I know for me, when I drank, it would shut off that inner critic. It was such a relief to shut that off. Of course, the problem is it's a problematic solution, and it leads to even later fierce attacks by your inner critic. So you wake up hungover after drinking, or you spend money and then you get the credit card bill. That inner critic gets you even worse. So it shuts it off temporarily, but it kicks your butt later, which is why it's not a good solution. But we all want to find a way to turn that inner critic off. So turning it off with drinking is not surprising. But it will be waiting for you in the morning when you're hungover, and it beats you up even more. And that's part of the problem. You know, sometimes the things we pick to soothe us also, we pay a high price for them. Some people do soothe themselves in ways that hurt them. I have people, for example, who pick their skin, pick down the nails and stuff. I pick nails down, they pick the sensitive skin under the nails. And my theory about that is that they want soothing, because when they're doing it, I think endorphins are released in the brain, and so it's actually kind of calming. But it also builds in a punishment. It's because it's painful when you're doing it, and it's painful the next day. And so what I think that is somebody who really wants to be soothed, but they feel unworthy of being soothed, because they grew up thinking they really weren't lovable and they didn't deserve love, so they didn't deserve soothing. So it's an attempt to soothe yourself, but do it in a way that also builds in the punishment for seeking it, since you believe down deep that you didn't really even deserve it, and or shouldn't even need it, because that's the other thing you're probably taught. It was not okay to have needs. Feeling numb a lot and not being sure what you're really feeling may suggest it wasn't safe to have feelings when you were growing up. It wasn't safe to express them. People who were told as a child when they were sad, I'll give you something to cry about, learned how to hide their sadness. You know, if we also shut off our feelings when there's nobody there to respond to them. If I had someone just this week tell me that if they fell and hurt themselves, they would never run to their parent for soothing or attention or a Band-Aid, because their parent would probably just scream at them that they're being clumsy. So they didn't get comforting and reassurance. They instead were told that it was their fault and they were clumsy, which would certainly make you shut off your feelings and learn not to go to people for help when you really need it. If you're somebody who takes care of everybody else and ignores your own needs, chances are your needs weren't responded to as a child. Maybe you were treated like you were a burden. When bad things happen to parents, children tend to think that they had something to do with it for a host of reasons we've discussed. But, you know, children who have parents that were mentally ill or alcoholics sometimes think it was because they were too needy. So they convince themselves that they'll never have needs, rather than respond to. So they were made to feel like they were a burden if they needed something from a parent. So they buried their needs because it was just too painful to have a need that you knew wasn't going to be responded to. And rather than risk constant disappointment, you convince yourself, I don't need anything. Or you give to others what you really needed for yourself. And that's a pattern that continues. I did my dissertation on the families of origin of those of us who go into the helping professions and looked at how it affected our work. But one of the questions I had on there, and I think almost everybody said yes, is I often give to others what I need for myself. So when you feel that you're overextending and burning out because you're giving, 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 I want you to stop and think, what do I need? Because that's your way of coping with not having your needs filled. You got your kudos growing up by being the one who took care of everybody else. I remember a man who grew up with an alcoholic mother and a very absentee father. He recalled with great fondness visiting his grandparents at the seashore in Rhode Island. And he said the first time he and his sister stayed with his grandparents, he couldn't believe it when his grandfather got up the first morning and said to his grandmother, "What do you think the kids want to do today?" And I think he turned to the kids and said, "What do you want to do today?" He was so completely blown away by the fact that an adult who cared about him wanted to know what he wanted to do that day. It was such a completely novel idea because his mother never woke up and said, what do you need today, kids? He was so completely blown away by that, and he never forgot that question, how much that question meant to him. What do you want to do today? It was just so novel that somebody cared about that. If you always put yourself last, again, this may be for, linked to what we're talking about, which means you're probably the parentified child in your family. Parentified means you had to be the little parent to fill in for a parent who's either absent or impaired. I had a guy tell me that he would go back and forth between his fighting parents, trying to be the family mediator when he was just 6 years old. I had another who shopped and cooked for her family, and I mean shopped and cooked every meal for her mother and her sister, beginning at about the age of 8. I also had a client who was sent out to talk to her grandfather, who was a paranoid schizophrenic, a very delusional and disturbed man, but her mother and grandmother would send her out to try to calm him down and talk to him when she was 10 years old. So, many of us are pressed into service at a very young age and have to be the little grown-ups that our parents are not being. And so that's a very hard habit to break if you've been doing it since you were very young. And it happens to a lot of kids. Are you a perfectionist? Well, you probably can't stand to make mistakes, and you live in fear of them being exposed. And again, this is probably deeply rooted in feelings of shame or fear that no matter how good you are, some perceived imperfection or flaw will wipe out all the good if it's revealed. So you grew up with parents that were never happy, it was never enough. And even if you did, you got all A's and you got one B, that's all they focused on. So even now, you're afraid of making mistakes. You're afraid that some flaw in you, and we all have some flaw because we're human beings. And if you are a human being, you cannot be perfect. But we live in fear that that one flaw will be revealed and it'll wipe out all the good, and people will never see us the same way again. This notion is called shame. Healthy shame is knowing that you're gonna be imperfect because you're a human being. Toxic shame is the fear that whatever imperfection you think you have will make you unworthy of sort of belonging to the tribe, that people would not want you around if they knew this one flaw. Of course, the irony is everybody has one, and we all live in fear of this, and people are probably much more accepting of us than we are of ourselves. But if you were chastised as a child when you made even one mistake, you probably are a heck of a perfectionist now. And you live with a deep fear that some imperfection could be revealed. A reluctance to take risks and risk the possibility of failing is also related to that fear of being shamed or revealed as flawed or imperfect in some way. Brene Brown has done a lot of writing and talking about this. Her book, Daring Greatly, explores shame in more depth, and it's on the handout that you should have. And again, if you don't have it, reach out to me or reach out to my boss, Sandra Satterfield, and we will email it to you. In fact, my experience is that most of us carry around a secret fear that we are somehow flawed or unlovable or inadequate, and we live in fear of it being exposed. Again, this is usually due to not feeling sufficiently loved in childhood. It is almost intolerable for a child to believe their parents wants to hurt them and doesn't love them. So they would conclude, as Judith Herman explained, that it was something about them that made them unlovable. And you carry that around to this day. Some of our poor choices in relationships reflect an attempt to fix a relationship with one or both of our parents. If you had an abusive or absentee father, you may pick partners who may initially appear to be very present, the kind of men who could protect you and be present for you, but they turn out to be people from whom you're going to need protection. It's a subtle process. I don't think people often go out looking for somebody who's going to hurt them. I think people present their best side in the early part of relationships, which is why you really should get to know somebody before you commit to them. But it turns out, and maybe they're compensating for the very thing that is their weakness. They're acting as if they're very go with the flow and they never get angry because they know they have a terrible temper. And it isn't until somebody's deeper into the relationship that they discover that the person is more like their parent than they had ever imagined. And in some ways, we stay in a bad relationship for a host of reasons, but one of them is that we're probably still trying to symbolically fix what we couldn't fix as children. So if you couldn't win attention from a neglectful father and you have a neglectful partner, you think maybe if I can win his love, maybe if I can get his attention, it sort of fixes something else. Again, not necessarily consciously. We pick somebody who's distant because we hope we can change them and that will heal that original wound. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually work out that way. Sometimes we pick people who don't treat us very well because we don't really feel worthy of love. And I think a lot of people carry that around. Perhaps you keep people at a distance because letting yourself open your heart fully is the ultimate act of vulnerability, and it's just too painful and scary. One of the most popular TED Talks is by Brene Brown. The link to it is in your handout. The talk is called The Power of Vulnerability, and she's talking about how powerful it can be if you can learn to tolerate vulnerability. But again, if vulnerability in childhood was met with being hurt, it's very scary to risk being very, very vulnerable. If in the past you were hurt when you opened your heart, you probably built a lot of invisible walls that always keep people at a safe distance. If you have problems saying no and you engage in a lot of people-pleasing behavior, you probably developed that when you learned that you would be abandoned or judged or responded to angrily if you didn't keep other people happy or try to keep them happy. How we respond to authority figures in general is a pretty good reflection of how we may have felt we had to act around a difficult parent. So if you have a difficult boss, some of your behaviors in coping with that difficult boss may be similar to the things you had to learn to deal with a difficult parent. Look at some other behaviors. Obsessive behaviors are often related to that need to feel in control. And it's a way to kind of focus and control all of your anxiety by channeling into just one thing. So I'm afraid of bridges. I'm afraid of airplanes. It's a way to make overall anxiety sort of less overwhelming because you kind of target it into one particular thing. And it makes it less overwhelming, but then that thing takes on a life of itself. So a lot of phobias are related to that, channeling anxiety into something more narrow. Of course, the choice of obsession may reveal a deeply personal meaning of that particular action. For example, a lot of obsessing hand washing and showering suggests the person feels dirty. And my experience is that often means that there's a history of sexual abuse. Not necessarily, it can also just be that they were made to feel dirty. One of my clients used to say he grew up in a neighborhood where he was called like the dirty Italian. So it could be any number of things. Now, depression is probably caused by many variables, including things like biochemical imbalances. So it's not just an adaptation to things in childhood. It probably is bigger than that, but it could also be in part tied to adaptations in childhood. So, for example, some people believe that depression is anger turned back on the self. And if you grew up in a household where it wasn't safe to be angry at people, you probably learned to turn anger back on yourself. And again, that can contribute to depression. It can also lead to depression is also sometimes believed to be caused by learned helplessness. What's learned helplessness? Well, they did these experiments, I think probably with rats, because I always use rats, and they put them in a box that had sort of a little barrier in between the two rooms, but it could jump over the barrier and go from one room to the other. And so in the beginning, it would shock the right room, and the mouse could jump over to the other side and be safe. But eventually what they did was they made it so, and this is just cruel, but they made it so that the mouse, no matter what side it jumped onto, it got shocked. And what they learned was the mouse would just finally lay down and give up. And that's the term they used to explain that was what we call learned helplessness. You learn that there's no way to escape, so you kind of just give up. Kids will do that too. If they can't escape a bad situation or they know that no one's going to come to their aid, they may kind of just give up and stop trying. And that may contribute to adulthood, depression in adulthood, when they face challenges and they feel that they can't succeed and they just give up and they just retreat from the world. But again, I think depression is more than just that, but that might be a factor that contributes to it. It's a way to withdraw from a painful world. Can also reflect the need to shed a former self and create a more deep connection with a more authentic self. So sometimes we withdraw because we need to really regroup and shed maybe who we had to be for everybody else and find out who we really are so we can have an authentic connection with ourselves. And depression can also be rooted in social isolation. And again, social isolation is often related to having too many unmet needs in childhood. Um, Now, while generalizations can be made, each person's problematic habit or symptom is really a unique coping mechanism that may have served them once, but and we all have them that served us once, but now undermine us. Dawn Markova, and her book is on your handout, gives the following example. A woman who was sexually abused as a child is bulimic. She gorges herself with food and then goes into the bathroom and vomits. What's right about that? What she means is, how does that symptom make sense? Perhaps as a child, she said, her parents controlled her very strictly. So this is her way of meeting the need to parent herself by feeding herself whatever she wants, but then controlling what she digests by vomiting, obviously. Perhaps she's demonstrating that when she was young, she also couldn't keep things out of her that were forced in or on her. And he's referring to sexual abuse by vomiting, but vomiting is her way of meeting the need to get rid of something that was forced into her. And perhaps it's also a way of unswallowing her rage at someone who abused her. My experience working with bulimics is that they had a deep need to feel loved, but then they felt so guilty afterwards and they felt so unworthy that they would then purge it. But also in terms of sexual abuse, because food goes through the mouth, I don't want to be quite so literal, but if somebody is sexually abused and they're orally raped, that kind of vomiting is a way to sort of symbolically purge that abuse. So those roots go very deep and they can be very complicated and they're very unique. But understanding the root requires a willingness to sort of dive down and think about what's right about what's wrong. There's a book by Dawn Markova called No Enemies Within. And I think the subtitle is What's Right About What's Wrong. And her notion is that it may seem like a wrong action, but it makes sense and it seems right if you put it in its perfect context. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to reflect on what may be the roots of some of the problematic behaviors or habits that you want to change. So think about one, and we're going to consider unraveling its meaning. It's essential that any effort to examine a source of embarrassment or frustration start with what I call eyes of compassion. You have to look at those behaviors as coping strategies that a little child adopted or you adopted at some point in your life, and look at it with compassion. Compassion for the person who adopted it because it felt like the only way to cope. Donna Markova, in that book, No Enemies Within, a creative process for discovering what's right and what's wrong, about what's right about what's wrong. She labeled the unclaimed parts of ourselves which create problematic behaviors the enemies within. So when she says no enemies within, she's talking about befriending those parts that we see as problematic and see as enemies. She says, in every wounding, there is a potential gift for healing. You will begin to sense that when you are willing to listen to your enemy, meaning the wounded part, through your heart, when your eyes see it through the light of compassion, when you allow yourself to touch it with mercy, when you reach to understand the needs of the wounded warrior and the helpless healer within, when you give the seeker the freedom to search for meaning in the darkness, your journey to wholeness has turned a corner and is inclined toward the light. So what she's saying is you have to look at it with compassion. You have to touch those wounded parts with mercy, because they really are hurt and wounded parts of yourself. I like to say we're mansions with many rooms, and some of those rooms are pretty and we let everybody see them, and some of those other rooms are messy and we're afraid to let anybody see them. Everybody's got the messy rooms, I assure you. But those messy rooms, they're messy for a reason. They represent a part of the self that still needs healing and tending to, but they must be approached with love and compassion. It's the only way to heal them. So there's a number of ways you can kind of look at the deeper meaning of your behaviors. You can ask yourself questions like, how might this behavior be connected to childhood experiences? Ask yourself what role you played in your family. Was it difficult to win the love of one or both of your parents? were your feelings and your needs responded to in a caring way? And I want to say, a lot of people will say to me, yeah, but that generation, they didn't know how to do that kind of stuff. They didn't understand. You know what? I agree. I'm not about demonizing them. I don't care why they did it. They were probably wounded themselves. I'm not interested in demonizing them. I just want you to understand that what you experienced subjectively did shape you. Even if it wasn't their intention, it did shape you. It did cause wounds. Even if those wounds were caused by a parent who just had to work too much because she was the only breadwinner. She didn't intend to cause hurt, but it still caused hurt. And you can't heal unless you take seriously the way in which that affected you. So again, it's not about having to demonize the people who did it. Obviously, there's some very abusive people. I think most of our parents harmed us unintentionally. Certainly, there are plenty that were intentional, but more often than not, it's unintentional. It's irrelevant. Put that aside. It's not about judging them. It's about understanding how it affected you so that you can change how it lives on in you. Give them the benefit of the doubt if you want. They probably were wounded too. So it's not about demonizing him. It's just about understanding how it really did shape you. So, what uncomfortable feelings might be behind a behavior that is maybe they're feelings you're trying to hide, like maybe you act super sweet when you're really pissed off because it wasn't okay to be angry, or maybe they are ways of expressing feelings that you're not okay with, but they can sneak out via your behavior. So I think of an example as somebody who gets really drunk in order to get taken care of. It's not okay for them to ask for somebody to take care of them. So what they do is they put themselves in a situation where somebody has to take care of them. And so that behavior is kind of hiding their need to be taken care of, but it's also a way to feed it or try to get somebody to meet that need. So for example, like I said, if it wasn't okay to express your anger growing up, you might turn that anger back on yourself and become depressed. Or you might get angry over really little things, but those little things have a much deeper meaning that's too difficult to think about. I often say to one of my clients, there are no little things because those little things are often reflective of a much bigger thing. And so those little things are your cues. Do not turn away from them or minimize them or dismiss them. They are a clue to this bigger hurt that exists inside. Maybe you don't get angry over maybe you get angry over little things because you don't want to look at the bigger thing that you're really angry at. For example, some people think it's not okay to be angry at somebody who dies, but it's normal. They have abandoned you, they've left you. Maybe it's irrational, they didn't choose to die, but you probably still feel abandoned. And so people will say, oh, no, that's not okay. I shouldn't feel that way. I always say to people, don't should on the feeling, should on how you're going to express it. What do I mean by that? It's always okay to feel what you're feeling. There's no bad feelings. They make sense in some contexts, and they just are. So don't should on yourself, say, I shouldn't feel that way, so I don't feel this way. Do instead think about how you should express that feeling. What's a safe way to express that feeling? So you're mad at somebody who abandoned you when they died. They didn't choose to, but you still feel abandoned and hurt. But you don't go up to the casket and punch them in the face. You use the should to determine how to express the feeling, but always let yourself know what the feeling is, because that's how you stay authentic. That's how you stay connected to your heart. Don't should on the feeling, say, I shouldn't feel that way. You do feel that way, and it probably makes sense in a larger context. How you choose to express it, yes, you have to be responsible for that. Use it then. Some people get sad when they're really angry. That tends to be women. It's not okay for us to get angry. So we get sad when we're really angry. Men are not allowed to be sad, so they get angry when they're really sad. Gross generalization, but related to how we are socialized. Ask yourself, what unmet need may the behavior attempt to either meet or hide? So, for example, do you give to others what you really need for yourself? Do you run yourself ragged until you get sick and have to be taken care of because it's not okay to allow yourself to just be taken care of? Are you able to express your need for nurturing, or do you hide this longing from yourself or others? You don't outgrow the need to be nurtured. You don't outgrow the need to be held or touched in a soothing way. We don't outgrow that. As adults, maybe you have to find appropriate ways to seek it out and whatnot, but you don't outgrow the need for that. You never do. And if you didn't get enough growing up, you probably really still need a lot more. So what purpose might your behavior or this habit you want to change, what purpose might it serve? And one of the ways to get at the purpose it serves is to look at the verb related to the action. Like, what is it your action does? What does this behavior do? For example, if does it control things? Is it, for an example, obsessive thought or a compulsive behavior? Is it a phobia? Do you have a lot of excessive self-control, so you never let yourself go? Do you have a need to control other people's? So is it an attempt to control? Is it, on the other hand, an attempt to fill yourself up? Is that what the behavior is about? Filling yourself up with food or drinking or shopping, etc. I hate to say shopping. There's no too much shopping. Of course, there can be too much shopping. Is it an attempt to please other people? Are you people pleasing at your own expense? Is it being unable to say no to people because you want to please them? Is it attempting to be who other people want you to be rather than being yourself? Again, the goal there is to please others. Why do you need to please others? What did you learn growing up or experience growing up that made you want to please others? Is it an attempt to avoid something? Is it an attempt to avoid feeling vulnerable? Is it perfectionism that represents an attempt to avoid being shamed? Is it excessive self-criticism because you don't want to be criticized by others? Is it to avoid being around others? Is it about keeping a distance from others? You don't take risks because they might hurt you. Do you avoid taking risks in general because you don't want to feel vulnerable? Do you flee relationships prematurely because you don't want to be hurt? Are you avoiding feelings? Are you numb a lot of the time? Or you do things to make yourself numb out, like working all the time or drinking and drugging? Are you doing that to avoid uncomfortable feelings such as anger and fear and sadness? Or are you avoiding trusting other people rather than risk that they might disappoint you? I had somebody who told me they really don't like to feel vulnerable and express their needs to other people because it just can't stand the thought that the person will say no and they'll be disappointed. And what I said to her is, they might disappoint you, but you'll probably survive it. And they might say, I can't do it now, but I can do it later. But again, what's the verb? What's the action? What are you trying to accomplish with this behavior? I don't think we're going to have enough time to do this, so I'm just going to draw your attention to a list of questions. Matt, you can put those up if you. Terrence, if you have a chance to put up those questions right now so people can see them. Again, this is on the handout, and we're not going to have time to do it, but I really invite you to do this later today or over the weekend, but do it soon. What is a habit or problematic behavior you would like to change? How might it be related to your childhood experiences? Do you recall when it first started? Try to go back. When did it first start? Were there things you had to do to please or win the love or avoid the wrath of your mother or your father? What uncomfortable feelings might you be trying to hide or maybe unconsciously trying to express? What unmet need might underlie this behavior? What is right about what is wrong? That's the Donna Markova idea that, the things that seem wrong were originally right in the sense that they served a purpose to fill us up, to help us avoid being hurt. So what's right about this behavior? Why would it have made sense to adopt that behavior back then? What might the habit be asking you to let go of? What is it asking you to hold on to? What lesson is it trying to teach you? And if you can you look at the behavior with eyes of compassion? And if you can't muster them for yourself, imagine the most loving person you know, or God, if you believe in God, or Jesus, or whoever you believe in, Buddha. Imagine the most loving person you know looking at that behavior and trying to help you figure out where it may have come from, so that you can look at it with eyes of compassion. And instead of beating yourself up, try to have compassion for the kid who adopted it when they were growing up and had no other choices or felt they had no other choices. In the interest of time, I'm just going to have to wrap up, but I want you to really take time to answer those questions for yourself. I'm guessing that as I spoke, certain things were resonating. Take time to know your internal enemy. I don't think of it as your enemy, but it's internal wounded self. As Donna Markova suggests, so what's right about what's wrong with you? I'm not going to ask you to kiss the garbage. What is important in this practice is that you enter into an intuitive conversation with your enemy about its needs. I would say your wounded child. Braille your way through, deep into the center of it. Embrace it. Jiggle it in your arms. Walk with it, making cooing sounds the way you would with a little baby that you loved, until you could sense what she needs. Beautiful, beautiful quote from Donna Markova. What's right about what's wrong about you. If you can figure out what wound gives rise to this problem, you can address the underlying wound. As I said, if, for example, you were taught you were unlovable, that your needs don't matter and that your feelings don't count, you can challenge this internal belief and respond to yourself today the way you should have been responded to in the past. Again, this is easier said than done, but it's a step in the right direction. It's really it's important to take time to break free of the destructive beliefs that anchored this behavior, the hurt feelings that anchored it, and change your behavior. Because once you've embraced them in order to survive, the ones you embraced in order to survive and to feel safe or loved. I can't begin to address all of that today. We'll do another workshop going into more detail on this, but safely release those forbidden feelings which keep those beliefs anchored in place. So if the truth is you call yourself stupid, but you really need to say, get in touch with how angry you are that your father always picked on you, write a letter to your father that you never send whether he's dead or alive, to get some of that anger out. And maybe it'll be easier to let go of that horrible message. If you were never allowed to feel angry as a child or have been unable to grieve the losses of your childhood, you need to release that backlog of repressed feelings. Sorry, I have a dog that knows how to express her feelings. Therapy is probably the safest mechanism for doing all this, but there are other healthy ways to vent your feelings. If you're angry, punch pillows, beat a mattress with a tennis racket, throw ice cubes against a brick wall. Change that internal dialogue. Imagine a loving person speaking to your inner child. So every time you engage in this behavior, I want you to stop and imagine a loving person talking to you about why you do this. Don't beat yourself up. Don't should on yourself. You've probably had more than enough of that. You're doing the best you can. Ultimately, the challenge is really to reparent yourself with both internal messages and self-care, and surrounding yourself with caring people who also nurture you. And maybe one of our next talks, because I haven't decided for September what we're going to do, we'll talk a little bit about healing the wounded inner child. But this is a good framework for starting. One more poem from Rumi, The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if there are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door, laughing, and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. I would say a guide from within. All right, I know we're just about out of time, so I don't know that we'll really have much chance for sharing of questions. And I don't know if, Terrence, have you gotten any typed in messages or questions that people have sent in?
I have not.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today and listening to this. I hope it gives you a lot of food for thought. And again, I can't say it strongly enough. Be good to yourself. Be kind to yourself. Treat yourself the way you should have been treated growing up. And if you can't do that every day or do it perfectly, love yourself over that too, because it is a challenge. We will have our next, I have to see, I think September 1st might be Labor Day weekend, so we may not do the Friday talk then, we may do it the following weekend, but make sure that you're on our mailing list, and if you're not, again, write to Sandra Satterfield, and I'll give you her email address again, S as for Sandra, S, and then Satterfield, SATTERFIELD, S Satterfield at hospice.org, I believe. Let me double check that.
It's S Satterfield at DelawareHospice.org.
DelawareHospice.org, all in small letters. And again, if you want to reach out to me, my email address is my name, all in small letters, Judith, Judith, Pearson, PIERSON at Juno.com. If you didn't get the handout, reach out to either one of us. We'll send it to you, and we'll keep you posted on the next topic. And thank you so much for coming.